Welcome to Peoples and Things, a podcast about human life with technology. I'm your host, Lee Vinsel, an associate professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech. You can reach me with comments and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or on Twitter at sts_news. I would love to hear from you. You know, a factoid that has really stuck with me over the past several years comes from a repeated discovery of United Way's ALICE program. And that's that about 40% of working American households can barely afford to make ends meet. 40%. What's that all about? Well, lots of things. But the biggest issue is that there appears to be too few good jobs in our economy. And what's a good job? Well, it's full-time. They don't try to cheat you out of benefits by arguing that you're part-time. They give you benefits. They pay you enough to make a living. They don't stress you out so bad that you lose your mind. They give you a role that you find fulfilling and even contributes to your growth. You know, stuff like that. The basics. Lots of things have led to the decline of these so-called good jobs, which, let's be real, were mostly held by white guys. One of the things that's led to the decline is that more people work in jobs that are temporary or contract-based or rooted in soft money or are a part of what we now call the gig economy. And that's the topic of historian Louis Hyman's book, Temp: How American Work, American Business, and the American Dream Became Temporary. In this conversation, Lou and I chat about how most mid-20th century secure jobs were possessed by white men, how temporary work began to rise in the post-World War II period, and how all of this led to the gig-based world we inhabit today. Lou and I also talk about how he has an alternative vision for the way forward around such jobs. We could live in a better future, Lou argues, where we give up on mid-20th century ideas of good jobs and start making temp work survivable by providing adequate support and assistance to citizens. It's a different way of looking at a set of topics about work and law and the life we want to live that are likely to be important issues for some time. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I had a lot of fun talking to Lou. Get excited. Lou, thanks so much for joining me today.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Lee. Thanks so much.
Lou, I think Temp's a neat book. When you talk about it with strangers, which you were doing an awful lot of when it first came out, what do you tell them it's about?
I tell them about the story of work in America and how it became insecure. So for me, the dominant narrative we have in this country is that work became secure and then it sort of betrayed us all, right? That's the story of the post-war dream falling apart. But as we tell that story, we don't really talk about what replaced those jobs for working Americans. And so when I wrote the book Temp, I wanted to tell that other story, not just the story of the fall of industrial unions, but the rise of alternative forms of work. And I wanted that story to be from top to bottom, so that it was not just the story of workers, but also of capital, and to tell those stories in an intertwined way.
You wrote two books about debt. So how'd you get from, which was also the subject of your dissertation work. So how'd you get from studying debt to thinking about temporary work?
Well, obviously, I want to think about happy things that people can be inspired by. No, I wrote about debt because when I went to grad school, I wanted to be a labor historian. And I realized, though, that while there were lots of good histories of labor, there were very few histories of working people's finances.
Hmm.
And debt is such a crucial part of understanding, working Americans' life and
Yeah.
middle class people's lives and rich people's
Yeah.
lives, that I wanted to understand that. So how did debt go from the margins of society to the center, right? So in the 19th century, you don't hear about the Vanderbilts and Carnegies making their fortunes on small loans to working people. No, they just had those people ground to dust in their
Right.
minds. But by the end of the 20th century, our biggest capitalist institutions were actively doing that. So that was the
Huh.
story of my first book, and then the second book was the sort of cultural shifts around that and its relationship to retail.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things I realized when I was doing that work was that I didn't really I talked about the sort of debt as sort of an extension of the changing way people were compensated or not compensated, right? That earnings were stagnant, that
Mm.
earnings were not just flatlining, but actually more volatile at the same time, and that debt was used to offset that volatility. And
Mm.
so I thought, well, I should really talk about the sort of origin of that volatility and that uncertainty and that insecurity and precarity. And that's where Temp came from. But also it came out of an experience I had as, a precarious member of the, academic workforce, that
Hmm.
I couldn't get a job after grad school, so I went to go work as a consultant.
That's right. I always forget this. I mean, not for long. Even if I just think about you, it comes back up. What'd you do as a consultant?
Well, after grad school, I couldn't get an academic job because I'm a historian, and that's a
Right.
terrible, terrible decision, right?
Yeah.
Except for the part where it's the best thing ever if you do get a job. It's a wonderful way to spend one's time. But so I had to pay my college debt, my student debt, and I needed a job, and so I applied for a job as a management consultant, and that's actually one of the origin points of this book. That I showed up to work on the very first day, and I sat down in my fancy suit in a fancy corporate high rise overlooking a beautiful river. And I realized that I actually had a very similar job to my very first job when I was
Hmm.
15, my first official job, not just cutting grass, but working as a temp in Baltimore
Huh.
in the 90s, back at AccuStaff, when being able to type was actually still a skill. And that
Yeah.
was my very first job, and I did database entry.
Huh.
And I realized, so I started thinking about the correspondences between my work as a consultant and as a temp.
That's cool, man. Earlier you said you thought of yourself as a labor historian when you first went to grad school, or you wanted to be one. Now you've very much come to focus on labor and work. I mean, you're in a you run a center for workplace studies. So is that still part of your identity? Is that how you think of yourself?
I think of myself as a labor historian, but and I think it's hard to study workers without studying businesses at the same time,
Yeah.
right? If you want to understand, although of course many people do, and it results in what always seemed to me as a very disjointed kind of historiography. That if
Yep.
you read the history of U.S. Steel written by a labor historian of the 70s and read the history of U.S. Steel written by a business historian, it's like they're two different
Totally.
planets. And so one of the things I tried to do is bring together my interests in the history of business, my interest in the history of labor. But of course, the history of work is more general than the history of labor in terms of labor unions and such. So
Yeah.
as I wrote the book, there are lots of places where I talk a lot about unions, but I also talk about people outside of unions. And I think that, as we are in a world now where only 6% of the private workforce is unionized,
Yeah.
it's a mistake to not talk about these other kind of workplace experiences. And that's what I tried to do in the book.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. One thing I really like about Temp is how you show that although many people have a kind of nostalgia for what they think of as like the traditional stable job of the mid 20th century, that this was, those jobs were largely only available to, well, white dudes, basically. So, like what is employment for realities for women and minorities and other folks who didn't fit that description in the mid 20th century? What did that look like?
Yeah, and I'm certainly not the first person to
Yeah.
observe this, but it's also something that you really can't say enough. I mean, there's such a gap between what people casually think about the world and what we know as historians. That if there's anything I talk a lot about with other historians is like how we need to just write about things we know
Yeah, totally.
and tell those stories again and again. So we come out of the New Deal. It's brought us a world where there's just so much more job security for office workers and factory workers who are white men. And so we kind of, in this all our nostalgia for this post-war job, we often want to ignore that reality that those promises were made to white men and more or less the women who love them. So for white women who had access to that kind of security, but only on the condition that they were married. And of course, African Americans and migrants of different kinds were all left out of that. And so what we did in the post-war was draw a big line between people who deserve security and those who didn't. And so a big part of the arc of the book is the story of how our contemporary insecurity is rooted in drawing this line in the post-war. So in the lives of the people who are left out of that security, we see the rehearsal for a new kind of economy that really effloresces in the 1970s and 80s through the work of migrants, both documented and undocumented, through the work of women, through the work of African Americans. And so that's part of the story of the book, about how it's not just a question of that security being promised to a few people, but also who's left out of it. Yeah. And in the end, of course, that the fact that people are left out eventually comes to get even those white men. Yeah. That the story of deindustrialization, the story of downsizing, these are all white male crises. This has long been the story for nearly every other group of people in America. In a lot of ways, that's a story of the gig economy today. When we talk about Uber and taxi drivers, we're very concerned because taxi drivers are men, whereas we don't really talk about women in the gig economy or women in the digital economy, which is women are doing much, much better in the digital economy for lots of reasons. So for me, this is the arc of the story about who counts, who's included, and who's excluded.
One of the, it turns out I didn't know that I wanted a history of the company Manpower, but when I read your book, I realized I did want that history. So tell us about the company Manpower, what it was, and why it's so important to this story of temporary work.
Yeah, so Manpower is this very first big temporary work agency. And if you think of temps, you think of, okay, the secretary is sick and we're going to send somebody in to replace him or her, although of course her in 1947 when this is founded. And this is a story that you think, oh, this doesn't matter that much, right? Temp work doesn't matter that much. And if you look at certain ways of accounting for the number of people in this economy, it's not that large. But if you actually look at the number of people who flow through that work in a year, it's some of the largest employers in America. And how does this occur? Why is it ignored? And what kinds of work are people doing? And so in the book, what I do is I look at how this fulfilled the promise of post-war security to those secretaries at first, that somebody gets sick and you need them replaced and they can have a sick day and not just get fired and replaced, right? But I also explore the limits of it. So why does the founder, Elmer Winter, begin to offer temporary work as a solution to large corporations? So, we all have things that are due at the end of the month, like billing or invoices or whatever. And there's other kinds of things that are due in different kinds of cycles. And so what Elmer Winter said to corporations was, let us do that weird stuff. Not just think of us as emergency replacements, but people who can handle volatile work demands. And, some companies did this. And then he said, well, what if we just did all the work that people didn't want to do in your company and just fire everybody that you don't want, at the lower rungs, and let us replace it. And what was surprising to me as I was doing this research, Lee, was just how much of a brick wall he faced. That it actually didn't sell, even though he had all kinds of studies to show that they were cheaper and more
Yeah.
efficient, because companies just didn't run that way. And this is something you get a lot in history, I think. The fallacy of reason. You encounters this idea that if something is backed up by data, then or it makes sense that it's going to happen. That's not how things work in the real world. In the real world, people do what already works with the experience they have. Just like recently with COVID. 3 years ago, if I told you that everyone was going remote, you'd be like, no, they're not.
Yeah.
And if I told you like you could actually run lots of corporate jobs remotely, they'd be like, no, you can't. But now we all have this experience and nothing's going to be the same. So this is sort of the story of data processing in the 1960s, which is the first big project that temps do that replace huge swaths of an office workforce. And in the aftermath, companies, particularly after a big crisis in 1969 that forces them to reimagine what the corporation is, they say, well, what does it mean to have a worker outside the firm? Maybe we do it. And like, what's the right ratio? And so all this sort of nibbling in towards that core secure workforce begins in that moment. And companies begin to say, wow, if we just hire all these workers, we can fire all these temps, no problem. It won't make headlines, and it will protect our real workers. And again, this question of who's real and counts and who's not. So it's really that's the story of manpower, and it's also the story of Kelly Girls, now known as Kelly Services, and the story of lots of other kinds of temporary firms. But I use him in the book as a way to talk about the evacuation of the middle of the corporation, as opposed to the top, where I talk about the history of the management consulting firm McKinsey, and also the way I talk about industrial jobs with migrant workers at the bottom.
Boy, I have a couple of questions that I want to follow up with, but maybe I'll skip ahead in my script and ask you about causality for a second, like why Winter was ahead of his time, I guess. So something you and I have talked a lot about is, this argument that innovation and economic growth have slowed down or plateaued with brief exceptions since the 1970s or so. I mean, Robert Gordon argues this. A bunch of people are arguing at this point. So do you think part of what was driving the move to temp work and worker reclassification was corporations searching for ways to reduce costs when, lots of industries weren't growing much or were struggling to have profits? I mean, was it this larger economic forces that are kind of like pushing them in this direction?
Well, I think that one of the things they do, if you just look at the 50s and 60s, is that they are looking for ways to first make the secure workforce work, both in offices and factories. So there were examples of, you could, by 1960, you could pick up the phone and replace your entire assembly line complete with foreman with a phone call. Wow. Right? And people did do that sometimes. They would shut down a factory, replace it with temps so that everybody could go on vacation for the same 2 weeks, which is something that is just unimaginable in the 1920s, right?
How quaint that they would even think about doing that.
Yeah. So what's interesting to me is the post-war is this period of breakneck technological acceleration for lots of reasons. But at the same time, a complete lack of innovation in corporate organization.
Yeah.
They minimize risk. This is the key insight of Galbraith, that the post-war corporation is all about having no market relationships, internalizing all processes, long-term investment horizons, and monopolies, right? So all these monopolies, of the technological monopolies of the post-war, generate lots of amazing technologies because they weren't concerned about short-term profits. And so the innovations, to my mind, are technological, but they're not organizational. There's all kinds of innovations that come with after 1970 So Elmer Winter would go to these guys, and they were all executives, and be like, and he served all the big corporations, so he had access to all these boardrooms, right? And he would say, look, like, you should just outsource your whole mail staff. You should outsource your.
Yeah.
And they were like, no, we're making enough money. We don't want to rely on anybody else,
Yeah.
and we make it work for us. And that is just a very different account of how capitalist growth happens, right? The minimization of risk.
Yeah.
Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, so what you just outlined is, I think, why they were so resistant in the 50s and 60s, right? You're saying, I mean, and we should, to give these folks credit, I mean, their habits were won from experience and training from the people who came before them. You know, it's only in the 20s and 30s that these firms are growing up so quickly. And so, you know, like, internalizing everything in the way you're talking about was something, it was a strategy that had worked, right? And so I guess then I'm wondering, like, what happened then, like, when the 70s come about? What changes the kind of firm's relationship to temp work, if that question makes sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is the real question, right? And for me at least, to understand the 70s, you have to understand the crisis of the 60s, which is not a crisis of the 60s per se, but a success, and that is the conglomerate. So there is an innovation in corporate organization in the 60s called the conglomerate, which, if you're just like a student of sci-fi, you think, oh, Tyrell conglomerate or some megacorp dystopian cyberpunk future.
Yeah.
But conglomerate actually has a very specific meaning. It means a firm that diversifies across unrelated industries. So the same company that makes basketballs also makes jet planes, and there's no obvious connection between those products, right? But this was seen as the sort of future of corporate organization in the 1960s, and all the biggest firms did this except for a very few. So, you know, firms you haven't heard of before, like Ling, Temco, Vout, LTV, you know, were at the forefront of this, but they convinced General Electric to do this too, right?
Yeah.
So this is when General Electric began to like make computers and jet engines and not just toasters. And so what happened around 1969 is that all this falls apart, that it turns out that you should have knowledge of one thing in relation to another thing.
Specialization matters? Is that what you're saying?
Specialization matters. That just sort of this general faith in managerial science is not true. And in all of this is built around financialization and sort of the use of finance in a way that hadn't existed since the 1920s. That is the leverage buyout. And it's done through a bullish stock market that feeds on itself, that allows people to borrow and buy. So a lot of the things that naively people who haven't studied this stuff associate with the 1980s, right, and the movie Wall Street, were actually happening in the 1960s. And so what we have after this collapse for the next 15, 20 years is this sort of unwinding of all these conglomerates. And that is the story of Wall Street, mergers and acquisitions and ... But it produces an intellectual crisis for the corporation. And I was surprised when I came to this position, because I don't think of myself as an intellectual historian. I often think of myself as an anti-intellectual historian.
Yeah.
But it really was in a lot of ways about ideas. So that there was this sort of lack of material foundation for the way these new corporations were being run. And in the aftermath, there was like a cottage industry of people trying to explain the future. And so what was interesting to me was that if you're historians like us, you're like, oh, it was economists. It was economists and the Chicago School. It was neoconservative economists and what we now call neoliberal economists. But if you look at businesses and like what businesses were actually doing and who they were reading, it wasn't those people. It wasn't it was Milton Friedman sometimes because he was on TV, but only because he was on TV.
Yeah.
The people they actually paid millions to and got the advice of were consultants.
Yeah.
Were the Boston Consulting Group, McKinsey, who were paid millions of dollars to tell them how to run their firms. And then they did. And so one of the things I do in the book is trace this history of ideas. as well as situate those ideas within the institutions of consulting itself. And for me, that was really the story. That was the story of how this outsourcing of work at the top led to an outsourcing of work in the middle, and then eventually to an outsourcing of work at the bottom, as sort of the interconnection of different ways of working from top to bottom allowed for a new kind of organization of the corporation that looks very different by 1980 than it does in 1960.
Am I right that consultants kind of play a dual role in the book, in that they are temporary workers in an important part, but they're also an important vector for this idea that maybe temporary work is the road forward for these firms?
That's the argument that I make, that if you pay someone $1 million to tell you what to do, you probably listen to them.
Yeah.
Where nobody's reading Econometrica to get their ideas on how to think about the firm.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean,
business schools too is another vector for you.
Yeah, business schools. And you do see the proliferation of finance at business schools during this moment, which historically had been very sidelined at business schools. It was seen as like a Jewish pursuit. And you have all these, white men who want to go into manufacturing. And so there's a real turn in this moment. There's an interesting story in the book Capital Rules, which is kind of old at this point, about sort of the near collapse of Standard & Poor's in the 60s, because there was just nothing going on in certain ways. Anyway, let's put that to the side. But yeah, I think that management consultants are an important vector, and technology consultants, which also I write a lot about in the book, which no one has ever asked me about in any interview, but I think it's like one of the messaging parts of the book.
I think it's interesting because I'm interested in those people, but why don't you tell us what technology consultants are?
Yeah, we can go back to it in a second. But yeah, so the story of like these management consultants is really spreading these ideas around, both as paid consultants and also just writing journals like McKinsey Quarterly, and writing books. And so on the one hand, you have these consultants, and then you also have this new generation of business gurus who become very popular, who like Toffler and Future Shock sort of explain the future, and in a lot of ways are quite right. And it's not clear, are they right because we made that world happen, or are they right because that was the course it was going? The tech consultants are interesting because they emerge out of accountants. And they are just very different than the strategy consultants. The strategy consultants all go to Harvard and are generally waspy.
They have cool glasses.
The technology, yeah. And if you look at the people who are in the accountancies, they're Catholic, they're Jewish, they are ethnic whites of various stripes. They don't go to Ivy League schools, but they all have CPAs. And so the story you have in the book is the story of why is there so much public accounting going on? And it's because of the SEC, but it's also the complication of the new multi-divisional corporation. You mentioned earlier that this new kind of bureaucratic corporation didn't exist. It didn't exist before the 1920s. There were a few examples here and there, but it wasn't the sort of main way things worked. And it's hard, right? As you know, corporations are complicated. So this army of accountants emerges with these very specialized skills. And as they're looking at books of these firms, they say, hey, you can save money doing this. You can save money doing that. We know your business. Here's how to save money. And so is born advisory services in accounting. And then they say, hey, you can save money by buying this computer. It's 1965, buy a computer. Buy this system 360 and install it. And thus technology consulting is born. And it comes out of accounting. And so there's this back and forth over the next 30 years between who is the real part of Arthur Andersen. Is it the tax audit people? Is it the consulting people? Is it the tech consulting people? And in the book, I trace that story because it's also the story of how corporations begin to rethink their relationship with technology and with workers as well. And to think about the rise of these people who are deciding on telling corporations how to run their affairs.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, part of what we're talking about now is that in the 80s and onwards, we do have a lot of organizational innovation, that we have like changing structures, right? One of the things that, gets a lot of attention around Uber and Lyft and these companies we'll talk more about a bit about later is that workers become classified as, contractors or things like this, right? I mean, that's an important part of this kind of temporary work shift. So that in itself is a kind of organizational innovation. How did they figure out how to do that? And, what did it take to make that happen?
Yeah, this real question of misclassification, right?
Right.
And the only reason it matters is because since the 1930s, we've developed this corpus of labor laws and employment laws that give formal employees all kinds of protections and rights in the workplace and benefits, like workers' comp. And if you're outside of that, you don't get those things. You're considered an independent contractor, but you get the ability to deduct your expenses. And there's all kinds of interesting ways in which there are different definitions of this. In the book, I go through different ways it's defined by the IRS, by legal regimes, by different legal bodies of law and lawmakers. And it's interesting that they're not always exactly the same. And what's at stake. And what's at stake is those things, benefits. But fundamentally, I think it's about a lot of the same issues that Elmer Winter talked about, which is power and control, just telling somebody what to do and when to do it. And this is one of the things that differentiates a contractor from a worker. It's like, do you control your own time? Do you control your own tools? Do you do your work process in the way you think is best? And so it's this kind of definition is meant for a carpenter who comes to your house and fixes your house. And like, you're like, hey, build me a porch. And he has his own tools and he knows how to build his own porch and ... It's not clear what that means when you're talking about somebody who writes a technical manual at Microsoft and sits in the same desk for 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, and sitting right next to somebody who's a Microsoft employee. So I think one of the things that's interesting is a series of cases called the Microsoft cases, where Microsoft is sued by workers there in the 80s and 90s for being they were claiming we're employees, we're not contractors. And eventually Microsoft loses. But I forget the exact number. If you have the book near you, you can look it up, but it's like 0.4% or something of their annual profit revenue, right? It's like they spend more on party dip than they do on this. And so it's kind of just like the cost of doing business. And I think for me, that was really telling that like the laws are there, people can use them, and it has absolutely no effect on the way people are actually working. And this is, for me, the story of the 80s and 90s, that there is the story of laws that protect a certain kind of person, a certain kind of worker. And then there's everybody else. And that everybody else part just keeps growing. And so, we can reform those laws or point to those laws as much as we want, but we still end up in a place where that is just not the laws, that's not the power that matters to regular working people.
And so Microsoft loses, but, how do companies succeed? Because, Apple and definitely Apple, I've heard from friends who work there, is full of temps, and most of these big companies are. So what changes that allows these companies to kind of keep going down the Microsoft road, even though Microsoft loses, in quotation marks?
Yeah, Microsoft loses. It's not just Microsoft, it's Apple. Even in the 80s and 90s, it's Apple, it's Hewlett Packard. I got access to the Hewlett Packard archives, and you can tell the story very easily through the story of Hewlett Packard, which is thought of as a place of secure work, but through this exact same period, they're importing the same kind of mistranslated Japanese ideas of efficiency through McKinsey. Like they're thinking about sort of racist ideas of Oriental mystique and this question of Japan and reorganizing. Basically, they learn what is a trigger for the IRS
Uh-huh.
or for courts, and they enforce it. So they make sure that if you are doing this kind of work, you don't go to the Christmas party. You don't
Right.
go to the softball team. You wear a different color badge.
Mm-hmm.
So all these sort of ancillary things of the workforce, the connections with your fellow employee, that the
Right.
occasional beer, none of this is available, and they're very particular about it.
Yep.
But yet they still try to make sure that this kind of work exists because it's cheaper. They have more flexibility. They have more power.
Mm-hmm.
And it's true at Google, and I don't know what today, but certainly a few years ago, that if you were a contractor, you could ride the Google bus. You just had to pay for it. And you couldn't get access to all the free
Yeah.
stuff of tech.
Interesting.
And so this is not a new thing, though. This is not Google. This is not Uber. This
Yeah.
goes back to the very origins of Silicon Valley as a way of thinking about work. This evasion of this labor law, and very successfully so. Right? It was, this is how they became the big tech giants that we know and love and fear today.
Mm-hmm. Let's bring this up to the present a bit. Where were gig or so-called sharing economy companies at when you wrote this book? I know you spent some time out in Silicon Valley, right? You were at Stanford for a year or a semester or something?
Yeah, so I was at Stanford in 2016, and so during that year, I spent a lot of time in the Apple archives um, at Stanford. Basically when Steve Jobs came back in the late '90s, the very first thing he did was first things he did. He walked into their archive at the headquarters, asked them what they had there, and they said, "Oh, we have all the archives." And he said, "The past doesn't matter," and shut it down.
That's so Jobs.
It is so Jobs. Anyway, they donated everything to the Stanford Library.
Wow.
So you can go there. And one of the things I'm most proud of in the book is a sort of labor history of the first Macintosh plant, looking at how, which was set up across the street in Fremont from NUMMI, the NUMMI plant, which is a very famous Toyota GM collaboration that people focus on when they're writing labor histories of the auto. You know a little bit about. Do you ever heard about cars, Lee?
Heard of them before.
Yeah. So, this is like the thing you talk about. And like right next door is the first Mac plant and no one talks about it.
That's fascinating.
And so I always thought that was so crazy.
Yeah.
So when I was there, I would regularly see self-driving cars at Google. Everyone was taking Ubers and Lyfts everywhere.
Yeah.
And it seemed like the future of autonomous cars. So when I wrote the book, I was, people were still trying to figure out what we thought about this. And so there was a large number of people who thought, oh, if we ban it, it'll stop. And certainly a large number of people who thought this is what's going wrong with America. And that always struck me as odd, because if you could ban Uber and Lyft tomorrow and it wouldn't make America an equal place for working people, it wouldn't, right?
Yes.
Like you'd have to believe that like everything was hunky dory before the smartphone. And you're a tech guy, Lee. When was this first smartphone?
I looked this up recently. Which definition are you using?
So let's say it's 2006. Let's say 2000. So let's go around there, right?
Yeah.
You would have to believe that in 2006 there was no inequality in America and things were great. So there's a weird way in which these companies act as a lightning rod for erasing Walmart, for erasing everything else. In a lot of ways, what's interesting to me is the organization of these new kinds of firms they've been more responsive than Walmart was. So if you look at Amazon, which is a terrible place to work if you're in the warehouses, right?
Yeah.
They're like, yeah, 15 an hour. Cool.
Yeah.
They were actually afraid of unionization, whereas Walmart was never afraid of unionization. And so it's an interesting question thinking about the gig economy and what it means about the future of work in 2016. And certainly the story's changed a bit. I mean, we're living kind of now in a future of work where we're all remote.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, I mean, like, what do you think has changed around the gig economy from, when you were writing this book and finishing this book up from the present? Like, what are the big shifts that you see?
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously AB5, right? And that sort of regulation in California that states tried to actually regulate the gig economy. I mean, one of the things that was so interesting to me when I was writing the book, I have a section called "What Labor Can Learn from Uber," um, which has not gone over well with labor. When I've talked about it with them, where I say things like, "Well, laws don't matter. Power matters.
Yeah.
The organization of workers matters, not lawyers. Lawyers are what destroyed the labor movement in America." This does not go over well when I
Mm-hmm.
say things like that. But I do think that there's a reliance on the strength of the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, a reliance on the strength of this corpus of laws that was an effect of the strength of the labor movement in the 30s and 40s and
Yeah.
50s. But it didn't cause that. There's a
Yeah.
way in which we tell the story of a bunch of laws were signed into place in the 30s, and then we had fair work. It's like, that's not what happened, you goody two shoes.
Well, they're all
Academic types.
lawyers love to think that law is super important and is causal or something like that. And actually, it's more like a lagging indicator of power and social movements and things like that, right?
I mean, justice is what's in the interest of the stronger, right? That's some old school knowledge right there. No, and so yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's auto workers shutting down factories and then throwing door handles at cops. That
Right.
gives labor power.
Right.
It's shutting down supply chains in the middle of the Great Depression, right?
Mhm.
That's the story. And so part of what Uber did was the same. They're like, laws don't matter. They're like, make it stick.
Yeah.
And that's the long lesson of Silicon Valley, that they haven't been regulated ever. That's why Silicon Valley has the more Superfund sites than anywhere else in the country. It's relying upon hundreds of thousands of undocumented workers for its success.
Mm.
This is one of the stories I tell in the book,
Yeah.
is that we think of tech work in the 80s as, nerds with HP calculators, but it's actually hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese and Chicano workers, legal and illegal, who are being pressed into the service of capital in a way that looks very much like, sweatshops of the 1880s or something like this. And so I think what's changed in the gig economy is this attempt to rein it in.
Mhm.
And has it been successful? I think we still don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
we know that Uber had carve outs. So that's changed. I think there's been a broad deflation of the tech, the tech optimism of just
Yeah.
5 years ago, right?
Right.
And I also think that there is now a broad incredulity towards autonomous cars.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of these firms thought of workers as sources of data that were being used to train their algorithms and
Yeah.
train their car driving. And they were transitional workforces that could be churned through and then traded up for AI. And now it's 2021 and I still have to drive my car. So I think that
Well, when
this
Uber
is-
and Lyft sold their self-driving car units, I mean, that fantasy is gone.
Yeah.
That whole vision, and these companies, they're not profitable. They're in like the bonfire business of just burning people's money, basically. And it's not really clear like what what a good profitable road forward is for some of these companies. It's a big question mark.
It's a big question mark for so much of this, and I think and it's a big question mark for American workers, right?
Yeah.
So one part of the book that I wrote about was thinking of inverting this question of like, why are we so concerned with Uber, that we think Uber is the cause? If you talk to latte drinking liberals, they're like, oh, I don't do that, I don't shop here, I don't buy that, I don't do these things. It's like, well, good for you, but people still need to make their rent, make their ends meet.
Yeah.
And the story of I think a lot of the gig workers are people for whom regular employment has failed them. They can't get enough shifts at Walmart or Starbucks, and then they turn to this as a way to sort of make up that gap. And there's data that supports this. There's been studies done that show when people have access to this kind of work, they borrow less to make up the gap. And so I think that's the story we need to think about. We need to think about like, well, why has regular employment failed people before we say go back to those jobs that are already terrible. And we know right now in the midst of COVID, people are not going back. They're like, I don't want to do that. that is not a long-term
Yeah,
policy.
I've been finding this over and over as I kind of look at waves of technology hype from the last 30 to 40 years. Is there's always, other people have written about this. We always talk about Amy Sue Bix and her great book on, the history
So
of
good.
technological unemployment. And, I think there's this constant wave of worries that like these technologies are going to put people out of work and this kind of stuff. And it's like, no, I mean, nanotechnology did not undermine our economy to the point that it massively put people out of work. It turns out that we can have a crappy economy full of shit jobs without that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I want to talk to you a bit more about kind of the way some folks think about this and the way, kind of hopeful visions you have for the future in a second. But I wanted to talk to you first about the study you did in Seattle, if I'm right. And like you looked at Uber data and, what you found in that work that you did.
Yeah, it was kind of like a turn for me in a lot of ways. I have an undergrad degree in math as well, and I did econometric stuff in my dissertation, so I'm comfortable with numbers. But there's a whole chapter that's all like data in my in my first book. But it just seemed important, and the folks at Uber and Lyft approached me and a group of people at Cornell to have access to their administrative data for their time data, their earnings data. And so we put together a study, and there's problems with it because we did it in the middle of COVID and lots of us had small children. And so it's limited in some ways, but I think for me, the big takeaway was the incredible variation in earnings and time, that we look at this data and we see every story about the gig economy confirmed. We see people who are just crushing it, making $40, $50 an hour. We see people who are being miserated, making $4 an hour. And this is just like, I think it's part of the ways in which our brains are wired for the average and not the variation. And so we want to say, well, what is the average wage? And I can tell you what the average wage is. And actually, it turns out it's about average for Seattle, which makes sense. It has to be a pretty affluent person who can get a car and drive around, and they probably have some alternatives available to them.
Yeah.
So they're not making $5 an hour, which some people like to have done very elaborate cost calculations to come to. But I don't think you need to bring people down to $5 an hour, which to say it's not a great job. $18 an hour is not a great job either in terms of like getting by. It's only comparatively good compared to the minimum wage or something along those lines.
Yeah.
But what struck me was the variation in earnings. I thought the variation in earnings was just astonishing because it's so different than people working a cash register or a checkout who basically earn within 50 cents or $1 of each other.
That's interesting.
And it is this. So there's that question of like risk and uncertainty. And so I'm in the process now of trying to arrange a new study that is more longitudinal, that is more platforms, has a whole state rather than just a city. And I'm excited to try and bring in lots of different questions around that to get a sense of what is actually going on with people, what accounts for this variation. Is it demography? Is it experience? Is it location? What is the story here? And it could be that this job is a terrible job if you're trying to do it full time, but it works if you're just kind of get a few hours in and save a little extra money. And so I think our imagination of work has not kept up with the reality of work. So a few years ago, I did a survey of New York State workers. And part of that, I immediately got the data set and I pulled it out and I was like, oh, this is amazing. And one of the sort of basic questions you ask on any survey is, are you a full-time worker? Are you a part-time worker? Yeah. Are you a temp or are you unemployed, right? And so I was like, all right, well, let's see people who drove for Uber. How do they think of themselves? And so, Lee, what do you think? How do you think people answered that?
Oh, my God.
Are they full-time? Are they part-time? Are they self-employed? Are they temporary? Are they unemployed if they're driving for Uber?
They're driving. Do they call themselves full-time if they're driving full-time?
They call themselves full-time. They call themselves part-time. They call
Yeah,
themselves
okay.
temporary. They call themselves
Yeah.
self-employed. They call themselves
That's really
unemployed.
interesting because it all has to do with where it fits in their lives, which there's a huge variation there.
It's a huge variation. It's one of the reasons why survey data just isn't very good at
Interesting.
dealing with this new kind of work, because it's just so we don't even understand what we mean when we say these words or how we
Yeah.
think about ourselves, and the categories are certainly not stable from person to person. And so
Mm.
this is why it's exciting to use the administrative data, as well as, because then
Hmm.
you get this sort of more objective take, which doesn't mean that people's subjective opinions don't matter. It just
Mm.
means that, as social scientists, we want to have a sense of that. um,
Is this why you have some skepticism? I think, I've seen like, is it the Bureau of Labor Statistics or one of these groups has, put out findings that temp work isn't going up very much according to some of these social surveys. But you're skeptical of that finding, right? I mean, is that fair?
Well, it's fair in the sense that, I believe them. I don't think they.
Yeah, no.
I
But it
think they.
has to do with their
I think they're,
methods, right?
yeah, they're very good methods.
Yeah.
But I think it's just one of the things where it's like, well, why are you not interested in their supplementary work? Why are
Yeah.
you not
Okay.
interested in things you do just a little bit at a time? And you see this a lot in people when you talk to people who want to regulate or worker activists. They are very concerned about full-time workers,
Yep.
as if people do this for fun side
Funsies.
money, like pin money or something. This is how you're talking
Yeah.
about temp workers in the 50s. They're like, oh, women are doing this so they can get a new color TV. It's like, no, that's actually not the case. Even in the 1950s,
Yeah.
or luxury first. Like, no, they want to pay their rent and their mortgage, and their husband is on strike.
Right.
Um, so this is, I think one of the things I think is happening is that there are now a portfolio of different kinds of jobs, the way we think about a portfolio of assets. If we're,
Yep.
a marginalist economist, this is how people think about it. So I think, how do we combine? And for me, this is one of the opportunities that could have a technical fix. Like, do I have an AI negotiating across multiple APIs to find the best job for me in the next hour?
Mm.
Like as the ultimate, temp firm for me and my work.
Yeah.
Who's going to willing to pay me? So I think there's ways in which capital is ahead of labor, but historically, as you know, that whenever there's new technology, capital uses it against workers, and
Yeah.
then labor manages to turn the tables again, right? This is the story of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. On the one hand, you have capital using new technology to create a national railroad network and coordinating with this new thing called a telegraph. But then workers are like, then coordinate themselves with the telegraph and then cut the lines. So it's possible
Yeah.
to think about counter technologies that are emergent out of this as well. And this is one of the things, if I'm hopeful, is thinking through what that means.
So, I mean, that's where I wanted to go next, actually, is I think part of the criticism I hear you make in the book and in the New York Times op-ed that was related to the book, and, I've heard you make other places too, is that so many other people who are concerned about the gig economy world and Uber and Grubhub and all these things are very intellectually fixated on this old mid 20th century vision of full-time employment. Okay. And the what they want to do is bring those jobs in line with that. That's how they think about this problem, right?
That's a good job to them.
That's a
Yeah.
good job to them. And part of what I hear you saying is like, I mean, here's the way I would put it, is like, we can imagine other ways of organizing work in society, because that job not only was it only belonged to white dudes for the most part, it wasn't even around for that long historically, right? I mean, you just like, it comes into, in the US, it comes into being like in the late 19th century or something like that. I'm probably fudging my dates, but something like that. It's around for 100 years maybe. So, I mean, for you, it seems like, if I hear you correctly, what you're saying is there's other ways to do this, right? There are other kind of futures that we can imagine when it comes to temporary work and these things. So play that out a bit. I mean, if you think of like positive futures around these things, what are some things you think about?
Yeah, whenever I hear people who are nostalgic for the good job, all I hear in my head is an old rock lyric. The only good boss is one that's dead. You know,
Who's this? Do you know?
Just Google it. You know who
Okay.
it is. And so I think in my head, I'm like, well, one of the reasons when I teach my labor history class, I make sure to start before wage labor. Because I think one of the important possibilities of history is to imagine other kinds of regimes. And students freak out when I'm like, wages didn't always exist as the main way we worked and exchanged value with one another.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very odd to me always when people who are ostensibly left are very nostalgic for like good wages. I'm like, that is not the same Marx I read. So I think that this is something useful to think about what kinds of possibilities does technology allow that was not possible before. So on the one hand, we have platforms like Amazon that are consolidating retail, consolidating power in logistics, consolidating power in supply. But platforms are actually quite different than the corporation. The corporations existed for quite some time as the only way that individuals can, this is the story of Galbraith, right? Can assemble access to markets and workers and capital and technology and resources. And the idea that you could do this as an individual or a small group of people through platforms to sell to the world, to buy from the world, to work around the world. To me, this seems kind of utopian and amazing in a certain not necessarily, right?
Yeah.
But certainly when you talk to a lot of these sort of Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, anarchist types, you're like, that's delusional.
Yeah, right. Yeah, definitely delusional. Yeah.
And that like Kickstarter is not the same as Bank of America, and Bank of America is not going anywhere. But I do think that there are interesting possibilities, especially as you think about sort of like platform cooperatives. Like, what does Uber look like if it's run by a bunch of platform cooperatives, cooperative way? And that kind of coordination is possible through the digital economy in a way that has never happened before. Corporations are not new, monopolies are not new, but the ability of individuals to connect is new, right? And right now it's mostly being used to exchange, laser cat videos or something like that.
Yeah.
But it could be used to sidestep a lot of those kinds of things. And again, not necessarily, and it's not to say that there isn't a place for corporations, but I also think that there's a lot of interesting things happening through the platform economy. And often when I say these things, people say, that is not what's happening at Uber. And I say, Uber is not the only thing that matters.
Right.
That there's also Etsy. And then if that person is a man,
he says,
they
what's
say,
that?
What is Etsy? And if that person is a woman, they say, I love Etsy.
Yeah.
What do you mean? And I say, well, hundreds of thousands of mostly women, a lot of rural women are making what they consider full-time jobs on Etsy by selling.
Yeah.
And when we look at that, we hearken back to thinking about, well, what does it mean to control one's time? What does it mean to control what you make? How you can engage with your total being in terms of creative pursuits? And then as you ask those questions, and you're less concerned about like, workplace injury and workers' comp, which is not to say that doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's just saying it's not the only thing that matters. Because there's an injury simply by having to go to an office. There's an injury simply by having to go to a factory, having to do the same thing over and over again. And so even for those white guys in the post-war, like whether you're filling out forms or sitting on an assembly line, hitting the same button over and again, this is crushing your soul.
Yeah.
And so how do we create an economy that liberates the soul and also is sustainable? And this is a moment when I'm in conversations with people and they say, oh, that's socialism. I'm like, cool.
Yeah, whatever. Who cares what we call it? I mean, but part of what you do talk about in the book is that if we're playing out like using these tools for more utopian ends, saying like Uber's not the road forward. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about going down positive roads with this stuff. In the book, you talk about, things that would help. That would include universal health care, maybe basic income. I can't remember if you suggest that or not. But there's social policies that you could pass that would reduce risk for individuals, right, and shelter them so they're not, so that the getting a job in a corporation is not the only option for having stability in your life. You could have a more stable, safe society in general, and then maybe these other options become more desirable.
Yeah, I mean, in the book I lay out conservative options. I
Mm-hmm.
lay out radical options. I just think that staying where we are is not working. And of course, since I wrote that book, the political culture of America has gotten even more divided. So I'm sure there's people who say, "Why did you even think about conservative options?" But to me, like, universal health care is a very conservative position.
Yeah.
Basic income is a very conservative position. These are saying, this is what every other industrial country does. And it says, we don't want to put the onus of this on companies and just let them do whatever companies do. But I think that, my personal favorite of those policy positions is when a stock is issued, issue one share of it into a holding company for the whole population and get your citizens share, which is this kind of like anarcho-socialist position that has no state control over the funds, but just like allows people to actually own capitalism. But I think that this is one of the questions we can ask ourselves, and always a question we have to keep re-asking ourselves. Like, how do technology doesn't do anything. Technology, I'm sure you've talked about your other, but technology is just one possible tool that humans can use. And it's often used to solve for social crisis. And we're in the midst of social crisis. And so if it's not algorithms and AI and Uber doing this to us, it's the fact that we've created a society where the majority of the population does not count. And that some people are taking advantage of that. And that's when we let them do it. And we encourage them to do so. And so that's, for me, that is the real crisis.
Yeah.
Also, part of that story is uncertainty, what you were talking about, right?
Yeah.
And so we talk a lot about income inequality. And I think everyone and their brother since Occupy now knows about income inequality, but that was not the case before 2010. Right? I'm happy to talk about that. But we don't talk enough about income volatility. And it's something that people in the top 20% who get salaries, who get steady paychecks, don't understand about the rest of the country. There was a study done that showed for the median household, like the dead center average household, about a little over half of them had month-to-month fluctuations in their income of 30%.
Jesus.
And just try to imagine saving on that, or where, even deciding where to live, right? So do you live at the place you are at the peak of that, in the middle, at the bottom? Do you know exactly where that is?
Yeah.
And that kind of volatility just is exhausting, right?
Totally.
Trying to plan for that.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing that this kind of on-demand work offsets. But it doesn't mean that this is the only way to do that, right? There's other kinds of technical solutions, low-cost loan systems, auto savings programs. There's all kinds of things that people can do. And so if inequality is a political problem, volatility is a technical problem. And in a lot of ways, we should solve that before we try to tackle inequality, I think, because it's less contentious and it affects more people. And is actually what makes people crazy. Am I going to have enough money this month to buy my groceries? Is something that hits people, even if they're not poor, if they're in the midst of volatility.
That's interesting. I'll have to think more about that. I mean, I certainly believe that uncertainty is, and the stress of this kind of volatility is just awful for people in general. Hey, before I let you go, I wanna I thought you did this neat project on the history of e-commerce, and I just want you to kind of just say a couple words. I think the primary output of it was a podcast. Is that right?
Yeah, although we're gonna probably do a book in the next year or so.
Okay.
On the history of e-commerce. Yeah, I was sort of like trying to think about what does e-commerce look like if you decenter Amazon.
Yeah.
And founders. Although we talked to a lot of founders and people like that, but I'm very excited about it. it's largely the story that we're working on it, the story of logistics and technology,
Yep.
and thinking about why it really got born in the 90s, in the midst of a post Cold War moment. And you think about, and technology is a big part of the story,
Yeah.
but the technology is important because of the political context that, just for instance, think about encryption. So encryption is legalized because there's no more communism, and it's legalized in the early 90s, right? And this is how Clinton can get this through, right? So the Clinton was very friendly to Silicon Valley and the sort of origin of the New Democrats, right? So I think we're going to tell a lot of that story, and maybe your listeners will be interested. The story of like the Apache Foundation, but also the story of, you know, Main Street America and retail, and sort of try to tell those stories together as a way to shed some light on the rise of a logistics-based capitalism.
Cool, man. I love that. I talk to my students about logistics all the time, because I think that and, you know, a lot of technologies, especially productivity enhancing technologies, haven't changed that much since the 70s. But I think logistics and entertainment, you know, like Netflix and crap like that, are the two big exceptions to that. And logistics clearly just has such a huge role in how we consume today. You know, it's just, yeah.
I think in a lot of ways, when I teach my classes, I talk about I don't use the term neoliberalism. I talk about finance and logistics, the moving of money and the moving of things.
Nice.
And that's the story after 1970, that we know how to make stuff. And this is also the story of Marx, right? You know, when we think about production and distribution, and the squeezing out of profit in the supply chain, this is the advancement of capitalism. So, you know, I'm glad you do that. I think it's an important story, and it's certainly been decentered in importance as we think about retail and logistics as part and parcel of the same thing, right?
Yeah. Lou, thanks so much for coming on and talking to me today, bud. It's been a lot of fun.
A real pleasure, Lee. Thank you, and thanks for having me on.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. Peoples and things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Peoples and Things is a production of Virginia Tech Publishing and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. Production activities are supported by the Athenaeum, a space in the library that acts as a hub for digital humanities teaching, learning, and creation. Joe Ford is the Athenaeum coordinator and digital humanities specialist at VT Libraries, and he serves as producer and sound engineer for the podcast. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. I also want to thank you for listening. Thanks.